Good morning, everyone. I am Nixon G. Magaysay from Social Studies 3C.
And I am Juliet Asimalag from Social Studies 3D.
And we are reporting about
Chapter 13,
the 20th Century Crisis. The period between 1914 and 1945 was one of the most destructive in human history. As many as 60 million people died as a result of World Wars I and II, the global conflicts that began and ended this era. As World War I was followed by revolutions, the Great Depressions, totalitarian regimes, and the horrors of World War II. It appeared to many that European civilization had become a nightmare. These are some key events happened before and after World War I. First is Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated by a Serbian nationalist. Second is militarism, nationalism, and alliances drew nations into war. Next, the United States entry into war helped the Allies. It was followed by the impact of the war at home led to the increase in the federal government's power, changed the status of women. Next is the Russian Revolution ended with the communist power. Next, peace settlements caused lingering resentment. And lastly, the League of Nations was formed.
Looking back from the past, the international peacekeeping until the 1900s, with the exception of the 7 Years' War, never in the history had there been a conflict that literally spanned the globe. The 20th century witnessed 2 world wars and numerous regional conflicts. As the scope of war grew, so did international commitment to collective security, where a group of nations joined together to promote peace and protect human life. So this is how the League of Nations was created. At the end of World War I, the victorious nations set up a General Association of Nations called the League of Nations, which would settle international disputes and avoid wars. By 1920, 42 nations had sent delegates to the League's headquarters in Geneva, Switzerland. When the League failed to halt Warlike's Act in 1930s, the same opponents pointed to the failure of collective security. The League of Nations was seen as a peacekeeper without a sword. It possessed neither a standing army nor members willing to stop nations that used war as diplomacy.
So this is when the United Nations was created. After World War II, the United States hosted a meeting to create a new peacekeeping organization. Delegates from 50 nations hammered out the Charter of the United Nations. To eliminate the root causes of war, the UN created agencies that promote global education and the well-being of children. In the 1948, United States delegate Eleanor Roosevelt convinced the UN to adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which committed the UN to eliminate oppression. The headquarters for the UN are located in New York City.
So these are what happened when United Nations was created. In 1945, United Nations was founded. In 1948, United Nations adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In 1950 to 1953, United Nations troops participated in the Korean War. In 1988, Nobel Peace Prize awarded to United Nations peacekeeping forces.
So we will be talking about the important dates in the World War I. So on 1914, the assassination of Archduke Francis Ferdinand sparks the World War I. Then on 1915, the German submarine sinks the Lusitania. Then on 1916, the Battle of Somme. On 1917, Russian Revolution and the United States enters the war. Then on 1918, Germany agrees to truce. And on 1919, Allies signed Treaty of Versailles. So we will be talking about the Battle of Somme. Sinasabi dito that on July 1, 1916, British and French infantry forces tried to attack German defensive lines along a front of about 25 miles or equivalent to 40 kilometers long near the Somme River in France. So sinasabi dito that each soldiers daw ay magdalang 70 pounds or 32 kilograms of equipments including rifle, ammunitions, grenades, a shovel, medkit, and a full water of bottle. So ito yung nagpapabigat sa pagtakbo at nagpapabagal sa mga soldiers. So sinasabi din dito that French and British soldiers daw, they tried to pass the no man's land or pumunta sa kabilang panig. Then, pero yung mga Germans daw ay may malakas na armas, which is the machine guns. Ito yung magpapatumba sa mga soldiers na umaatake sa kanila. Then, according to Philip Gibbs, isang English journalist na pumunta dun sa sa battle, may nakita daw siyang mga soldiers na sobrang bata pa or binata pa um, para sumabak sa isang gera. Then, may nakita din siyang mga putol-putol na katawan. Siguro dahil sa explosions or doon sa mga grenades, and also siguro dahil din sa mga machine guns, kasi yung machine guns na yun ay sobrang lakas na kayang pumutol ng mga katawan. Then, sinasabi din dito that on the first day of the Battle of Somme, about 21,000 British soldiers have died. And also, after 4 months daw of fighting, the British had advanced only 5 miles or equivalent to 8 kilometers, about 1 million Allied forces daw, and German soldiers lay dead or wounded.
These are another key date mapping. First is on 1882, Triple Entente was formed. Second is in 1907, the Triple Entente was formed. And lastly, in 1914, the World War I begins.
So we will be talking about World War I. On June 28, 1914, the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Archduke Francis Ferdinand was assassinated in the Bosnian city of Sarajevo. So sinasabi dito sa may isang eyewitness na which is named John Kerry. Sinasabi niya dito na nakita niya daw yung isang lalaki nag-step forward from the crowd. Then binunot yung baril niya sa kanyang coat. Then nagpaputok ito ng 2 beses. Yung unang tinamaan daw dito, which is yung asawa ni Archduke, which is si Archduchess Sofia, na nooy nagdadalang tao at tinamaan sa tiyan, kaya agad itong namatay. Yung pangalawang putok daw, doon pa lang tinamaan si Archduke Francis Ferdinand na tinamaan malapit sa kanyang chest. May isang word daw na lumabas sa kanyang bibig bago siya bawian ng buhay, which is yung asawa niya. Yung pangalan is Sofia. Then, namatay na daw si Archduke Francis Ferdinand. Kaya, ito yung nag-start ng World War I.
We will now tackling the nationalism and the system of alliances. First half of 19th century, liberals believed that if European states were organized along national lines, there would be a peace in Europe, but they were wrong. The system of European nation-states that emerged later in the century led not to cooperate but competition. Rivalries over colonies where trade grew during an age of frenzied nationalism and imperialism expansion. In the 19th century, Triple Entente was formed in 1882. It composed of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. On the other hand, Triple Entente was formed in 1907. It composed of France, Great Britain, and Russia.
A series of crises tested these alliances. Then, most serious were the Balkan crisis between 1908 and 1913, when Austria-Hungary and Russia rivaled one another for influence. By 1914, European states were angry with one another and eager to revenge. The Irish had been discontented with the British rule for centuries, but a resistance movement grew strong in the early 20th century. During World War I, Irish nationalists staged a major rebellion in the capital of Dublin. The British put down the rebellion, but the harsh punishment only fueled the desire for the independence, which was achieved in the 1921.
So let us now move in the internal descent. The national desires were not only the source of internal strife at the beginning of the 20th century. The socialist labor movements also had grown more powerful. The socialists were increasingly inclined to use strikes, even the violent ones, in order to achieve their goals. Some conservative leaders, alarmed at the increase in labor strife and class divisions, feared that European nations were on the verge of revolution. In the view of some historians, the desires to suppress internal disorder may have encouraged various leaders to take the plunge into the war in 1914.
So, let's talk about militarism. The growth of mass armies after 1900s heightened the existing tension in Europe. The large size of these armies also made it obvious that if war did come, it would be highly destructive. Conscription, a military draft, had been established as a regular practice in most Western countries before 1914. With its 1.3 million men, the Russian army had grown to be the largest. The French and German armies were not far behind, with 900,000 each. The British, Italian, and Austro-Hungarian armies numbered between 250,000 and 500,000 soldiers each.
Outbreak of war, summer 1914, militarism, nationalism, and the desire to stifle internal dissent may all have played a role in the starting of World War I. However, it was the decisions made by the European leaders in response to another crisis in the Balkans in the summer 1914 that led directly to the conflict.
The Serbian problem. As we have seen, states in southeastern Europe had struggled for many years to free themselves of Ottoman rule. Furthermore, the rivalry between the Austria-Hungary and Russia for the dominations of these new states created serious tensions in the region. In 1914, Serbia, supported by Russia, was determined to create a large, independent Slavic state in the Balkans. Austria-Hungary, which had its own Slavic minorities to contend with, was equally determined to prevent that from happening. Many Europeans saw the potential danger in this explosive situation. The British ambassador to Vienna anticipated war in 1913.
So these are some data about the assassination in Sarajevo. So just like Mr. Sumakase said earlier, that this assassination happened on June 28, 1914. Archduke Francis Ferdinand, the heir to the throne of Austria-Hungary, and his wife Sofia visited the Bosnian city of Sarajevo. A group of conspirators waited there in the street. So this group of conspirators is the member of Black Hand. They are the Serbian terrorist group that wanted Bosnia to be free of Austria-Hungary and become a large part of Serbian kingdom. Itong mga terrorist nito is pinaplano nilang patayin si Archduke Francis Ferdinand along with his wife. Kinabukasan, isang kasamahan nilang terorista ang naghagis ng bomba sa sasakyan ni Archduke Francis Ferdinand, kaso hindi ito sumabog sa sasakyan ni Archduke Francis Ferdinand. Yung bomba na yon is sumabog sa kasunod nitong sasakyan. Pero, isang Bosnian Serb ang nagsucceed na patayin si Archduke Francis Ferdinand at ang asawa nito. Ang yun ay si Gavrilo Princip, a 19-year-old Bosnian Serb.
So next is Austria-Hungary response. The Austria-Hungarian government didn't know about whether or not the Serbian government had been directly involved in the Archduke's assassination, but it did not care. It saw an opportunity to render Serbia harmless once and for all by the display of force. As the Austrian foreign minister put it, Austrian leaders wanted to attack Serbia but feared Russian intervention on Serbia's behalf. So they sought the backing of their German allies. Emperor William II of Germany, his chancellor, responded with a blank check saying, "The Austria, till the world comes to an end, the ultimate decision will rest with the sword."
Russia mobilizes. Russia was determined to support Serbia's cause. On July 28, Tsar Nicholas II ordered partial mobilization of Russian army against Austria-Hungary. Mobilization is a process of assembling troops and supplies and making them ready for war. In 1914, mobilization was considered as an act of war. Leaders of the Russian army informed the Tsar that they could not partially mobilize. Leaders of Russian army informed the Tsar that they could not partially mobilize. Their mobilization plans were based on war against both Germany and Austria-Hungary. Mobilizing against Austria-Hungary, they claimed, would create chaos in the army. Based on this claim, the Tsar ordered full mobilization of Russian army on July 29, knowing that Germany would consider this order as an act of war. The conflict broadens. Indeed, Germany reacted quickly. The German government warned Russia that it must halt its mobilization within 12 hours. When Russia ignored the warning, Germany declared war on Russia on August 1. Like the Russians, the Germans had a military plan. It had been drawn up under the guidance of General Alfred von Schlieffen, so known was the Schlieffen Plan. The plan formed a two-front war with France and Russia, who had formed a military alliance in 1894.
According to Schlieffen Plan, Germany would conduct a small holding action against Russia, while most of the German army would carry out a rapid invasion of France. This meant invading France by moving quickly along the coastal area through the Belgium. After France was defeated, the German invaders would move to the east against Russia. Under the Schlieffen Plan, Germany could not mobilize its troops solely against Russia. Therefore, it declared war on France on August 3. About the same time, it issued an ultimatum to Belgium demanding the right of German troops to pass through Belgian territory. Belgium, however, was a neutral nation. On August 4, Great Britain declared war on Germany, officially for violating Belgian neutrality. In fact, Britain, which was allied with the countries of France and Russia, was concerned about maintaining its own world power. As one British won the war, what would be the position of friendless England? By August 4, all the great powers of Europe were at war.
So let us now discuss about the war. 1914 to 1915, Illusions and Stalemate. Before 1914, many political leaders had thought that war involved many political and economic crises, that it would be not worth fighting. Others had believed that the diplomats could easily control any situations and prevent war. At the beginning of August 1914, both ideas were shattered. However, the new illusions that replaced them soon proved to be equally foolish. Government propaganda ideas spread to influence public opinions for or against a cause, had worked stirring up of hate threads before the war. Now, in August 1914, the urgent pleas of European governments for defense against aggressors fell on receptive ears in every nation at war. Most people seemed genuinely convinced that their nation's cause was just a new set of illusions also feed the enthusiasm for war. In August 1914, almost everyone believed that the war would be over in a few weeks. People were reminded that almost all European wars since 1815 had in fact ended in a matter of weeks. Both the soldiers who boarded the trains for the war front in August 1914 and the jubilant citizens who showered them with flowers as they left believed that warriors would be home by Christmas. Western Front. Germany hopes for a quick end to the war rested on the military gamble. The Schlieffen Plan had called for a German army to make a vast encircling movement through Belgium into the northern France. According to the plan, the German forces would sweep around Paris. This would enable them to surround most of the French army. The German advance was halted a short distance from Paris at the First Battle of the Marne on September 6 to 10. To stop the Germans, French military leaders loaded 2,000 Parisian taxicabs with French troops and sent them to the front line. The war quickly turned into a stalemate, as neither the Germans nor the French could dislodge each other from the trenches they had dug for shelter. These trenches were ditches protected by barbed wire. Two lines of trenches soon reached from the English Channel to the frontiers of Switzerland. The Western Front had become bogged down in trench warfare that kept both sides in virtually the same position for 4 years.
The Eastern Front. In contrast to the Western Front, the war on the Eastern Front was marked by mobility. The cost in lives, however, was equally enormous. At the beginning of the war, the Russian army moved into eastern Germany but was decisively defeated at the Battle of the Tannenberg on August 30 and the Battle of Pasurian Lakes on September 15. As a result of these defeats, the Russians were no longer a threat to German territory. Austria-Hungary, Germany's ally, fared less well at first. The Austrians had been defeated by the Russians in Galicia and thrown out of Serbia as well. To make the matters worse, the Italians betrayed their German and Austrian allies in the Triple Alliance by attacking Austria in May 1915. Italy thus joined France, Great Britain, and Russia, who had formed the Triple Entente, but now were called the Allied Powers, or Allies. By this time, the Germans had come to the aid of the Austrians. A German-Austrian army defeated the Russian army in Galicia and pushed the Russians far back into their own territory. Russian casualties stood at 2.5 million killed, captured, or wounded. The Russians had almost been knocked out of the war. Buoyed by their success, Germany and Austria-Hungary joined the Bulgaria in September 1915, attacked and eliminated Serbia from the war. Their success in the east would enable the Germans to move back to the offensive in the west.
1916 to 1917, the Great Slaughter. On the Western Front, the trenches dug in 1914 had by 1916 become elaborate systems of defense. The lines of trenches for both sides were protected by barbed wire enlargements up to 5 feet, about 1.5 meter and 30 yards, about 27 meters wide. Concrete machine guns nests and other gun batteries supported further back by heavy artillery. Troops live in holes in the ground, separate from each other by a strip of territory known as no man's land.
The tactics of trench warfare. The unexpected development of trench warfare baffled military leaders. They had been trained to fight wars of movement and maneuver. The only plan generals could devise was to attempt a breakthrough by throwing masses of men against enemy lines that had first been battered by artillery. Once the decisive breakthrough had been achieved, they thought they could return to the war of movement that they knew best. At times, the high command on their other side would order an offensive that would begin with artillery barrage to flatten the enemy's barbed wire and leave the enemy in a state of shock. After softening up the enemy in this fashion, a mass of soldiers would climb out of their trenches with fixed bayonets and hope to work their way toward the enemy trenches. The attacks rarely worked because men advancing unprotected across open field could be fired at the enemy's machine guns. In 1916 and 1917, millions of young men died in the search for the elusive breakthrough. In 10 months at Verdun, France, in 1916, 700,000 men lost their lives. Over a few miles of land, World War I had turned into a war of attrition, a war based on wearing the other side down by constant attacks and heavy losses.
War in the air. By the end of 1915, airplanes had appeared to the battlefront for the first time in the history. At first, planes were used to spot the enemy's position. However, planes soon began to attack ground targets, especially enemy communications. Flights for control of the air occurred and increased over time. At first, pilots fired to each other with hand-held pistols. Later, machine guns were mounted on the noses of planes, which made the skies considerably more dangerous. The Germans also used their giant airships, the Zeppelins, to bomb London and eastern England. This caused little damage but frightened many people. Germans' enemies, however, soon found that Zeppelins, which were filled with hydrogen gas, quickly became raging infernals when hit by anti-aircraft guns.
Widening of the war. Because of the stalemate on the Western Front, both sides sought to gain new allies who might provide a winning advantage. The Ottoman Empire had already come into the war on Germany's side in August 1914. Russia, Great Britain, and France, the Allies, declared war on the Ottoman Empire in November. The Allies tried to open a Balkan front by landing forces at Gallipoli.
The Allies tried to open the Balkan front by landing forces at Gallipoli, southwest of the Constantinople, in April 1915. However, Bulgaria entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, as Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire were called. A disastrous campaign at Gallipoli forced the Allies to withdraw. In return, for Italy entering the war on the Allied side, France and Great Britain promised to let Italy have some Austrian territory. Italy, on the side of the Allies, opened up a front against Austria-Hungary. By 1917, the war that had started in Europe had truly become a world conflict. In the Middle East, a British officer known as Lawrence of Arabia in 1917 urged Arab princes to revolt against their Ottoman overlords. In 1918, British forces from Egypt destroyed the Ottoman Empire in the Middle East. For their Middle East campaigns, the British mobilized forces from India, Australia, and New Zealand. The Allies also took advantage of Germany's preoccupations in Europe and lack of naval strength to seize German colonies in the rest of the world. Japan, a British ally beginning in 1902, seized a number of German-held islands in Pacific. Australia seized German New Guinea.
The entry of the United States. At first, the United States tried to remain neutral. As World War I dragged on, however, it became more difficult to do so. The immediate cause of the United States' involvement grew out of the naval wars between Germany and Great Britain. Britain had used its superior naval power to set up a naval blockade of Germany. The blockade kept war materials and other goods from reaching Germany by sea. On May 7, 1915, the British ship Lusitania was sunk by German forces. There were about 1,100 civilian casualties, including over 100 Americans. By January 1970s, however, the Germans were eager to break a deadlock in the war. By January 1970, however, the Germans were eager to break a deadlock in the war. When the Emperor expressed concern about the United States, he was told not to worry. The British would starve before the Americans could act, even if the Americans did not intervene. Admiral Holzendorf assured the Emperor, "I give your Majesty my word as an officer that not one American will land on the continent."
The home front, the impact of total war. As World War I dragged on, it becomes a total war, involving the complete mobilization of resources and people. It affected the lives of all citizens in the warring countries. However, remote they might be from the battlefields, masses of men had to be organized and supplies had to be manufactured and purchased for years of combat. Germany alone had 5.5 million in uniform in 1916. This led to an increase in government powers and the manipulation of public opinion to keep the war effort going. The home front was rapidly becoming cause for as much as the war of the front. Increase in government powers. Most people had expected the war to be short, so little thought had been given to a long-term war needs. Governments had to respond quickly. However, when the war machines failed to achieve their goals, many more men and supplies were needed to continue the war. To meet these needs, government expanded their powers. Countries drafted tens of millions of young men for that elusive breakthrough to victory. Throughout Europe, wartime governments also expanded their power over their economies. Free market capitalistic systems were temporarily put aside. Governments set up price, wage, and rent controls, rationed food supplies and materials, regulated imports and exports, and took over transportation system and industries. In effect, in order to mobilize all the resources of their nations for the war effort, European nations set up planned economy system directed by government agencies.
Manipulation of public opinion. As the war continued and casualties grew worse, the patriotic enthusiasm that had marked the early stages of World War I waned. By 1916, there were signs that civilian morale was beginning to crack under the pressure of total war. War governments, however, fought back against the growing opposition to the war. Authoritarian regimes, such as those Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary, relied on force to subdue their populations. Under the pressure of the war, however, even democratic states expanded their police powers to stop internal dissent. The British Parliament, for example, passed the Defence of Realm Act, or DORA. It allowed the government to arrest protesters as traitors. Newspapers were censored and sometimes their publication was even suspended. Wartime, governments made active use of propaganda to arouse enthusiasm for the war. At the beginning, public officials needed to do little to achieve this goal. The British and French, for example, exaggerated German atrocities in Belgium and found that their citizens were only too willing to believe these accounts.
So we will be talking about the British nurse named Edith Cavell. Edith Cavell was born in Norfolk, England. She trained as a nurse and moved to Brussels in 1907 to head the Berkendel Medical Institute. After the outbreak of war, the institute became a Red Cross hospital. Cavell worked to shelter French and British soldiers and help them reach safety in the Netherlands. So these German military authorities were outraged with the actions of Edith Cavell. Then they wanted and ordered Edith Cavell to be executed and shot before her execution. So, sabi ni Edith Cavell, I am glad to die for my country. Then, the French and British military authorities, they wanted Edith Cavell to be an example of the German barbarism. The Germans insisted they had the right to execute any traitor, whether man or a woman.
So let us now tackle the Lusitania. Passengers boarding the British liner RMS Lusitania in New York on May 1, 1915 for the voyage to Liverpool, England, knew of Germans' threat to sink ships bound for the British Isles. Built 8 years earlier, the Lusitania was described as a floating palace. So bakit nga ba tinawag na floating palace itong Lusitania? Because of the structures and the design of this ship. Walter Schwieger, a 30-year-old commander of the German submarine U-20, fired a single torpedo at the Lusitania from a range about 750 yards or 686 meters. Captain William Turner of the Lusitania saw the torpedoes wake from the navigation breach just before the impact. One passenger said that million-ton hammer hitting a steam boiler 100 feet high. A second, more powerful explosion followed, sending a geyser of water, coal, and debris high above the deck. So these are the picture of Captain William Turner of the Lusitania and Walter Schwieger of the German submarines who shoot the Lusitania ship with torpedo.
So there is a newspaper came out after the Lusitania sank. The news of the disaster raced across the Atlantic of 1,959 people aboard. Only 764 were saved. The dead included 94 children and infants. Questions were immediately raised. Did the British Admiral give the Lusitania a deep weight warning? How could one torpedo have sunk her? Why did she go down so fast? Was there any truth to the German claim that Lusitania had been armed? From the moment the Lusitania sank, she was surrounded by controversy. Americans were outraged by the attack, which claimed about 123 citizens. Newspaper called the attack deliberate murder and foul deed, and former President Theodore Roosevelt demanded revenge against Germany. The attack on the Lusitania is often credited with drawing the United States into World War I. However, President Woodrow Wilson thought he had vowed to hold Germany responsible for its submarines attack, knew that the American people were not ready to go to war. It was almost 2 years before the United States joined the conflict in Europe. So there is the biggest puzzle that has been the hardest to solve. Why did the liner sink so fast despite of the size and the structure of this ship? So the newspaper speculated that the torpedo had struck munitions in the cargo hold, causing the strong secondary explosion. Divers later reported a huge hole in the port side of the bow, opposite where munitions would have been stored.
The Russian Revolution. As you will learn, out of Russia's collapse in 1917 came the Russian Revolution. Its impact could be felt all over the world. After its defeat by Japan in 1905 and the Revolution of 1905, Russia was unprepared both military and technology for the war of World War I. Russia had no competent military leaders, so Tsar Nicholas II insisted on taking charge of the armed forces despite of his lack of training. In addition, Russian industry was unable to produce the weapons needed for the army. Many soldiers trained using broomsticks. Others were sent to the front without rifles and told to pick one from the dead comrade. Given these conditions, it is not surprising that the Russian army suffered from incredible losses. Between 1914 and 1916, 2 million soldiers were killed, and another 4 to 6 million wounded or captured. By 1917, the Russian will to fight had vanished.
Beginnings of this upheaval. Tsar Nicholas II was an autocratic ruler who relied on the army and bureaucracy to hold up his regime. Furthermore, he was increasingly cut off from events by his German-born wife Alexandra. She was a willful and stubborn woman who had fallen under the influence of Grigory Rasputin, an uneducated Siberian peasant who claimed to be a holy man. Alexandra believed that Rasputin was holy, for he alone seemed to be able to stop the bleeding of her son Alexis. Alexis, the heir to the throne, had hemophilia. It is a deficiency in the ability of the blood to clot. With the Tsar at the battlefront, Alexandra made all the important decisions. She insisted on first consulting Rasputin, the man she called her beloved, never to be forgotten, teacher, savior, and mentor. Rasputin's influence made him an important power behind the throne. He did not hesitate to interfere in the government affairs. As the leadership at the top stumbled its way through a series of military and economic disasters, the Russian people grew more and more upset with the Tsarist regime. Even conservative aristocrats who supported the monarchy felt the need to be something to save the situation. For a start, they assassinated Rasputin in December 1916. It was not easy to kill this man of incredible physical strength. They shot him 3 times and then tied him up and threw him into the Neva River. He drowned, but not before he had managed to untie the knots underwater. The killing of Rasputin occurred too late, however, to save the monarchy.
So let us now tackle the March Revolution. At the beginning of 1917, a series of strikes led by working-class women broke out in the capital of Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg. A few weeks earlier, the government had started bread rationing in Petrograd after the price of bread had skyrocketed. Many of the women who stood in the lines waiting for bread were also factory workers who worked 12-hour days on March 8. About 10,000 women marched through the city of Petrograd demanding peace and bread, and down with autocracy. Soon the women joined by other workers. Together they called for general strikes. The strike shut down all factories in the city on March 10. Alexandra wrote her husband Nicholas II at the battlefront. This is a hooligan. This is a hooligan movement. If the weather were very cold, they would all probably stay at home. Nicholas ordered troops to break up the crowds by shooting them if necessary. Soon, however, large numbers of the soldiers joined to the demonstration and refused to fight the crowds. The Duma, or legislative body, which the Tsar had tried to dissolve, met anyway. On March 12, it established the provisional government, which mainly consisted of middle-class Duma representatives. This government urged the Tsar to step down because he no longer had the support of the army or even the aristocrats. Nicholas II did step down on March 15, ending the 300-old Romanov dynasty. So the provisional government, headed by Alexander Kerensky, now decided to carry on the war to preserve Russia's honor. The decision to remain in the World War I was a major blunder. It satisfied neither the workers nor the peasants, who tried to angry from years of suffering, wanted above all an end to the war. The government was also faced with the challenge to its authority, the Soviets. The Soviets were councils composed of representatives from the workers and soldiers. The Soviet of Petrograd had been formed in March 1917. At the same time, Soviets sprang up in army units, factory towns, and rural areas. The Soviets, largely made up of socialists, represented the more radical interests of the lower classes. One group, the Bolsheviks, came to play a crucial role.
So next is some trivia. The mystery of Anastasia. Tsar Nicholas II, his wife Alexandra, and their 5 children were murdered on the night of July 16, 1918. Soon after, rumors began to circulate that some members of the family had survived. In 1921, a young woman in Daldorf, Germany claimed to be the Grand Duchess Anastasia, youngest daughter of Nicholas II. Some surviving members, convinced that she was Anastasia, Grand Duke Andrew, Nicholas II's first cousin, said after meeting with her, "For me, there is no definitely doubt. It is Anastasia." Later, the woman claiming to be Anastasia came to the United States, while in the New York, she registered at a Long Island hotel as Anna Anderson and soon became known by the name. In 1932, she returned to Germany. During the next 30 years, she pursued a claim in Germany's court for part of the estate left to the Empress Alexandra's German relatives. In the 1960s, in the United States, she became even better known as a result of a popular play and film, Anastasia. In 1968, Anna Anderson returned to the United States, where she died in 1984. In 1994, the DNA testing of the tissues from Anna Anderson revealed that she was not the Grand Duchess Anastasia. In all probability, Anna Anderson was Franziska Schankowska, a Polish farmer's daughter who had always dreamed of being an actress. So next is the rise of Lenin. The Bolsheviks began a small faction of a Marxist party called the Russian Social Democrats. The Bolsheviks came under the leadership of the Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known to the world as V.I. Lenin. Under Lenin's direction, the Bolsheviks became a party dedicated to a violent revolution. Lenin believed that only violent revolution could destroy the capacity and the capitalist system. A vanguard forefront of activists, he must form a small party of well-disciplined professional revolutionaries to accomplish the task. Between 1900s and 1917, Lenin spent most of his time abroad when the provisional government was formed in the March 1917. He saw an opportunity for the Bolsheviks to seize power. In April 1917, German military leaders, hoping to create disorder in Russia, shipped Lenin to Russia. Lenin and his associates were in a sealed train to prevent their ideas from infecting Germany. Lenin's arrival in Russia opened a new stage of the Russian Revolution. Lenin maintained that the Soviets of soldiers, workers, and peasants were ready-made instruments of power. He believed that the Bolsheviks would work toward gaining control of these groups and then use them to overthrow the provisional government. At the same time, the Bolsheviks reflected the discontent of the people. They promised an end to the war, the redistribution of all the land to the peasants, the transfer of factories and industries from capitalists to committees of workers, and the transfer of government power from the provisional government to the Soviets. 3 simple slogans sum up the Bolsheviks' program: peace, land, bread, workers, control of production, and all power to the Soviets. The Bolsheviks seized power. By the end of October, the Bolsheviks made up a slight majority in the Petrograd and Moscow Soviets. The number of party members had grown from 50,000 to 240,000, with Leon Trotsky, a dedicated revolutionary, as head of the Petrograd Soviet. The Bolsheviks were in the position to claim power in the name of the Soviets. During the night of November 6, Bolsheviks forced their seized the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. The government quickly collapsed with a little bloodshed. This overthrow of provisional government coincided with a meeting in the Petrograd, the All-Russian Congress of Soviets, which represented local Soviets from all over the country. Outwardly, Lenin turned over the power of the provisional government to the Congress of Soviets. The real power, however, passed to the Council of People's Commissars, headed by Lenin. The Bolsheviks, who soon renamed themselves the Communists, still had a long way to go. Lenin be an easy task. It would mean the humiliating loss of such Russian territory. There was no real choice. However, on March 3, 1918, Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany and gave up the eastern Poland, Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic provinces. To his critics, Lenin argued that it made no difference. The spread of the socialist revolution throughout Europe would make the treaty largely irrelevant. In any case, he had promised peace to the Russian people. Real peace did not come, however, because the country soon sunk into civil war.
So let us now tackle the civil war in Russia. Many people were opposed to the new Bolshevik or communist regime. These people included not only groups loyal to the Tsar but also liberals and anti-Leninist socialists. These groups were joined by the Allies, who were extremely concerned about the communist takeover. The Allies sent thousands of troops to the various parts of the Russia in the hope of between 1918 and 1921. The Communists, a Red Army, forced to fight on the many fronts against these opponents. The first serious threat to the Communists came from Siberia. Here, an anti-communist, a white, force attacked western wards and advanced almost to the Volga River before being stopped. Attacks also come from the Ukrainians in the southwest and from the Baltic regions. In the mid-1919, white forces swept through Ukraine and advanced almost to Moscow before being pushed back. By 1920, however, the major white forces had been defeated and Ukraine retaken. The next year, the communist regime regained control over the independent nationalist government in Georgia, Russia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. The royal family was another victim of the civil war. After the Tsar abdicated, he, his wife, and their 5 children have been taken into captivity. In 1918, they were moved into Ekaterinburg, a mining town in the Urals. On the night of July 16, members of the local Soviet murdered the Tsar and his family and burned their bodies in the nearby mine shaft.
Next is the triumph of the communists. How had Lenin and the communists triumphed in the civil war over the seemed to be overwhelming forces? One reason was that the Red Army was well-disciplined fighting force. This was largely due to the organizational genius of Leon Trotsky. As Commissar of War, Trotsky reinstated the draft and insisted on rigid discipline. Soldiers who deserted or refused to obey orders were executed on the spot. Furthermore, the disunity of the anti-communist forces weakened their efforts. Political differences created distrust among the whites and prevented them from cooperating effectively with one another. Some whites insisted on restoring the Tsarist regime. Others believed that only a more liberal and democratic program had any chance of success. The whites then had no common goal. The communists, in contrast, had a single-minded sense of purpose. Inspired by their vision of new socialist order, the communists had the determination that comes from revolutionary zeal and conviction. The communists were also able to translate their revolutionary faith into practical instruments of power. A policy of war communists, for example, was used to ensure regular supplies for the Red Army. War communists meant government control of banks and most industries, the seizing of the grain from the peasants, and the centralization of state's administration under communist control. The communist instrument was revolutionary terror. A new red secret known as the Police Cheka began a red terror aimed at the destruction of all those who opposed the new regime. Much like the reign of the terror in the French Revolution, the red terror added an element of fear to the communist regime. Finally, the presence of foreign armies on Russian soil enabled the communists to appeal to the powerful force of Russian patriotism. At one point, over 100,000 foreign troops, mostly Japanese, British, American, and French, were stationed in Russia in support of anti-communist forces. Their presence made it easy to the communist government to call all the patriotic Russians to fight foreign attempts to control the country. By 1921, the communists were in total command of Russia. In the course of the Civil War, The communist regime had transformed Russia into a centralized state dominated by a single party. The state was also largely hostile to the Allied powers because the Allies had tried to help the communist enemies in the Civil War.
End of the war.
So, next is the tank played a role in bringing end to the World War I and foreshadowed a new kind of warfare because these tanks were used to pass the no man's land and avoid the barbed wires and the machine guns that have the other side. The use of armored vehicles were greatly used in conquering the obstacles that have in the no man's land and occupying the other side.
So we will now tackle the last year of the war. The year 1917 had not been a good one for the Allies. The Allied offensiveness on the Western Front had been badly defeated. The Russian Revolution, which began in November 1917, led to the Russia's withdrawal from the war a few months later. The cause of the Central Powers looked favorable, although war weariness was beginning to take its toll. On the positive side, the entry of the United States into the war in 1917 gave the Allies a much-needed psychological boost. Along with fresh men and material, in 1918, American troops would prove crucial.
Next is a new German offensive. For many, the withdrawal of the Russians offered new hope for a successful end to the war. Germany was now free to concentrate entirely on the Western Front. Erich von Ludendorff, who guided German military operations, decided to take one final military gamble, a grand offensive in the West to break the military stalemate. The German attack was launched in March 1918. By April, German troops were within about 50 miles, equivalent to 80 kilometers of Paris. However, the German advance was stopped at the Second Battle of the Marne on July 18. Fresh American troops had arrived, supported by hundreds of tanks, threw the Germany back over the Marne. Ludendorff's gamble had failed. With more than 1 million American troops pouring into France, Allied forces began a steady advance toward Germany. On September 29, 1918, General Ludendorff informed German leaders that the war was lost. He was demanded that the government task for peace at once.
So we will now tackle the collapse and armistice. German officials soon discovered that the Allies were unwilling to make peace with the autocratic imperial governments of Germany. Reforms were begun to create a liberal government, but these efforts came too late for the exhausted and angry German people. On November 3, sailors in the town of Kiel in the northern Germany mutinied. Within days, councils of workers and soldiers were forming throughout northern Germany and taking over civilians and military officers. William II gave in the public pressure that left the country on November 9. After William II's departure, the Social Democrats under Friedrich Ebert announced the creation of the Democratic Republic. 2 days later, on November 11, 1918, a new German government signed an armistice. This armistice is a truce or an agreement to end the fighting.
So next is revolutionary forces. The war was over, but the revolutionary forces it had set in motion in Germany were not yet exhausted. A group of radical socialists, unhappy with the moderate policies of the Social Democrats, formed the German Communist Party in December 1918. And a month later, the Communists tried to seize power in Berlin. The Social Democratic government, backed by the regular army troops, crushed the rebels and murdered Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, leaders of the German Communists. A similar attempt at the Communist Revolution in the city of Munich in southern Germany was also crushed. The new German Republic had been saved from radical evolution. The attempt at revolution, however, left the German middle class with a deep fear of communism. The Austria-Hungary too experienced disintegration and revolution. As war weariness took the hold of the empire, ethnic groups increasingly sought to achieve their independence. By the time the war ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was no more. The empire had been replaced by the independent Republic of Austria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, along with the large monarchical state called the Yugoslavia. Rivalries among the nations that succeeded Austria-Hungary would weaken Eastern Europe for the next 8 years.
So we will now discuss about the peace settlements. In January 1919, representatives of 27 victorious Allied nations met in Paris to make a final settlement of the Great War. Over a period of years, the reasons for fighting World War I had changed dramatically. When European nations had gone to war in 1914, they sought territorial gains. By the beginning of 1918, more idealistic reasons were also being expressed.
Next is the Wilson's proposal. No one expressed these idealistic reasons better than the US President Woodrow Wilson. Even before the end of the war, Wilson outlined 14 points to the United States Congress, his basis for a peace settlement that he believed justified the enormous military struggle being waged. So, Wilson's proposal for a truly just and lasting peace included reaching the peace agreements openly rather than through secret diplomacy, reducing armaments, military forces, or weapons to a point consistent with the domestic safety, and ensuring self-determination, the right of each people to have its own nation. Wilson became the spokesperson for a new world order based on democracy and international cooperation. When he arrived in Europe for the peace conference, he was enthusiastically cheered by many Europeans. Wilson soon found, however, that more practical motives guided other states. The Paris Peace Conference. Delegates met in Paris in early 1919 to determine the peace settlement. At the Paris Peace Conference, complications became obvious. For one thing, secret treaties and agreements that had been made before the war had raised the hopes of European nations for territorial gains. These hopes could not be totally ignored even if they did not conflict with the principle of self-determination put forth by Wilson. National interests also complicated the deliberations of Paris Peace Conference. David Lloyd George, Prime Minister of Great Britain, had won a decisive victory in elections in December of 1918. His platform was simple: make the Germans pay for this dreadful war. France's approach to peace was chiefly guided by its desire for national security. On January 25, 1919, the conference accepted the idea of League of Nations. In return, Wilson agreed to make compromises on the territorial agreements. He did so because he believed that the League could later fix any apparent settlements. Clemenceau also compromised to obtain some guarantees for French security. He gave up France's wish for a separate Rhineland and instead accepted a defensive alliance with Great Britain and the United States. The US Senate refused to ratify this agreement, which weakened the Versailles peace settlement.
So let us now discuss about the Treaty of Versailles. The final peace settlement of Paris consisted of 5 separate treaties with the defeated nations, the Germany, Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey. The Treaty of Versailles with Germany, signed at the Versailles Theatre, France on June 28, 1919, was by far the most important. The Germany considered it a harsh peace. They were especially unhappy with Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, which declared that Germany and Austria were responsible for starting the war. The treaty ordered Germany to pay reparations for all the damage which the Allied governments and their people had been subjected as a result of the war, imposed upon them by the aggregation of Germany and their allies.
a new map of Europe. As a result of the war, the Treaty of Versailles and the separate peace treaties made with the other Central Powers such as Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Turkey, the map of Eastern Europe was largely redrawn. Both the German and Russian empires lost much territory in Eastern Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disappeared. New nation-states emerged from the lands of these three empires: Finland, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Austria, and Hungary. New territorial arrangements were also made in the Balkans. Romania acquired additional lands from the Russia, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Serbia formed the nucleus of a new state called Yugoslavia, which combined Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. The Paris Peace Conference was supposedly guided by the principle of self-determination. However, the mixture of peoples in Eastern Europe made it impossible to draw boundaries along neat ethnical lines. Compromises had to be made, sometimes to satisfy the national interests of the victors. France, for example, had lost Russia as its major ally on Germany's eastern border. Thus, France wanted to strengthen and expand Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Romania as much as possible. Those states could then serve as barriers against Germany and Communist Russia. As a result of compromises, almost every Eastern Europe state was left with ethnic minorities. Germans in Poland, Hungarians, Poles and Germans in Czechoslovakia, Hungarians in Romania, and the combination of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, Macedonians, and Albanians in Yugoslavia. The problem of ethnic minorities within the nations would lead to later conflicts. Yet, another centuries-old empire, the Ottoman Empire, was broken up by the peace settlement. To gain Arab support against the Ottoman Turks during the war, the Western Allies had promised to recognize the independence of Arab states in the Ottoman Empire. Once the war was over, however, the Western nations changed their minds. France took control of the Lebanon and Syria, and Britain received Iraq and Palestine. These acquisitions were officially called the Mandates. Woodrow Wilson had opposed the outright annexation of colonial territories by the Allies. As a result, the peace settlement created the Mandate system. According to this system, a nation officially governed another nation as a mandate on the behalf of the League of Nations, but did not own the territory.
So let us now discuss the last part of this chapter, the war's legacy. World War I shattered the liberal, rational society that had existed in the late 19th and early 20th century. The death of the almost 10 million, as well as incredible destruction caused by the war, undermined the whole idea of progress. Entire populations had participated in the devastating slaughter. World War I was a total war, one that involved a complete mobilization of resources and people. As a result, the power of governments over the lives of their citizens increased. Freedom of press and speech were limited in the name of the national security. World War I was made the practice of a strong central authority a way of life. The turmoil created by the war also seemed to open the door to even greater security. Revolutions broke up old empires to create new states, which led to new problems. The hope that Europe and the rest of the world would return to normalcy was, however, soon dashed.
So that's it for this chapter. Thank you for listening.